It was a cold night on the highway, the kind where the air felt like it could freeze your bones. Jack, a long-haul trucker, was driving his rig across the vast, empty road. He had been on the road for hours, the engine of his truck humming steadily as the miles stretched on. It was just him, his truck, and the dark sky above. The headlights from the truck sliced through the night, casting long shadows across the road. The only other light came from the faint glow of distant stars and the occasional flicker of a street lamp along the highway. There were no other cars. The road seemed endless, like it went on forever. Jack had seen many lonely nights on the road. It came with the job. He didn't mind it most of the time. After all, he loved the freedom that driving gave him, the open road, the wind in his hair, and the silence that allowed him to think. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was the way the empty road seemed to stretch on longer than usual. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was 3:00 a.m. He was getting close to the town he would be passing through in about an hour, but for now, the road was deserted. As Jack focused on the road ahead, he noticed something strange up ahead, a small figure standing in the middle of the highway. At first, he thought it might just be a trick of the mind, his eyes playing games with him after so many hours on the road. But as he got closer, it became clear. There was indeed someone standing there. His heart skipped a beat. Jack wasn't sure what to do. The figure was too far away to tell whether it was a person or something else. He squinted, trying to make out any details. It wasn't an animal or debris. This was definitely a person, and they were standing right in the middle of the road. The thought of hitting someone by accident sent a chill down Jack's spine. He had seen too many accidents on the road to take this lightly. Instinctively, he slowed down. His foot eased off the accelerator, and the truck rumbled quieter, as if it, too, knew something was wrong. Jack watched as the figure grew closer. The person was moving now, slowly, as if they couldn't decide whether to stay or move. Jack's mind raced. Should he just drive past, or should he stop to check if they needed help? He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling building in his gut. Something wasn't right. By the time he was close enough to see the person clearly, Jack was almost at a complete stop. The girl was small, maybe 18 years old, with long, tangled hair that blew in the wind. She was wearing a thin jacket, and her bare feet were cold against the asphalt. Her face was pale, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She was shivering, and her eyes were wide with fear. But what struck Jack most was her gaze. There was something in her eyes, something desperate, as if she had nowhere else to go. He couldn't just drive away. He had to stop. Jack pulled the truck to the side of the road, the brakes screeching slightly as the truck came to a halt. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming urge to help this girl. Something about her, the way she stood there alone in the dark, made his heart ache. The last thing he wanted was to leave her stranded in the cold, with no one to help her. He opened the door and stepped out into the chilly night air. The wind whipped through his jacket, but Jack barely noticed it as he walked toward her. His boots crunching on the gravel, he called out gently, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't move. Her eyes flicked toward him, but she didn't say anything. Jack took a step closer, his voice softer this time. "Are you lost?" She nodded faintly, still too scared to speak. Jack's worry deepened. "Come on, it's freezing out here. Let me help you." As he reached her, she flinched. Jack paused, not wanting to make her feel more uncomfortable. "It's okay. I'm just trying to help. What happened?" The girl didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, trembling, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Jack waited, trying to be patient, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The silence between them stretched on, as cold and heavy as the night itself. Jack took another step forward, his voice low and calm. "You're safe now. You don't have to be scared." The wind howled through the empty highway, carrying with it the cold of the night. Jack stood just a few feet away from the young girl, who was still trembling in place, her eyes wide with fear. He could see she wasn't just cold. She looked lost and panicked, like someone who had been running for a long time. Jack's heart went out to her. He had seen all sorts of things on the road, but this felt different. This felt urgent. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the anxiety building in his chest. "I'm here to help," Jack said again, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to be afraid." The girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't call the police. I just need help. I'll be fine. Please don't make the call." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. Why wouldn't she want the police? Was she in trouble? The fear in her eyes only seemed to grow as she looked around, almost as if she were expecting someone to show up at any moment. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack said, his tone reassuring. "But if you need help, I think the best thing is to call the police." "No." She suddenly jerked back, her hand shooting out to stop him. She took a step away from him, her whole body tense, as though the very idea of the police was terrifying to her. "You don't understand. He'll come for me if you do that. Please, don't." Jack took a step back, giving her some space. He wasn't sure what to think. He had met people in all sorts of situations on the road, but this girl, her fear was like nothing he had ever seen. Her eyes darted around the dark road, her body trembling more violently now. She looked over her shoulder again, almost like she was expecting someone to leap out of the shadows. "Who is he?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Is someone chasing you?" The girl bit her lip, her hands shaking as she clutched the thin jacket around her. I can't explain it all," she stammered. "But if you call anyone, he'll find me. And then you too. He's dangerous. He's been hunting me." Jack's stomach dropped. This was no longer just some girl lost on the road. This was something much darker. But Jack couldn't just leave her out here, especially if someone was after her. It wasn't like him to ignore someone in need. "I'm not leaving you here," Jack said firmly. "You're not alone. You can't stay out here in the cold, and I'm not just going to drive off. We need to get you somewhere safe." The girl's lips trembled as she looked at him, her eyes full of fear. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand. He'll find me anywhere. He knows where I go. Please, just don't call the police." Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just some lost girl needing help. Something serious was going on, something far beyond a simple case of being stranded on the highway. He didn't want to press her too much, but the fear in her eyes told him that time was running out. If someone was after her, he couldn't risk waiting any longer. "Listen," Jack said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm not going to leave you out here. I'll take you somewhere safe, okay? You just have to trust me. But I need you to tell me what's really going on. You're not going to get hurt, I promise. But I can't help you if I don't know the truth." For a moment, the girl didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her chest rising and falling quickly with her shallow breaths. Jack could see she was weighing the decision in her mind, battling with whatever fear was holding her back from telling him everything. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. He's been following me for days. I don't know who he is, but he won't stop. He's always there, just out of sight. And every time I think I'm safe, he shows up again. I thought I lost him when I started walking along the highway, but I guess I was wrong." Jack's heart tightened as he listened. Whoever this person was, he was clearly someone who had been tormenting her for a while. The girl's fear was real, and it was deep, something she hadn't just picked up on a whim. She was running from something serious. "Okay," Jack said, his voice soft but filled with determination. "I'm not letting you face this alone. I'll help you get somewhere safe, but I need you to trust me. We'll figure this out together, okay?" The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking back to the dark road, but she nodded slowly, a flicker of relief crossing her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jack was ready to get her to safety, and no matter what it took, He wouldn't let her face whatever was chasing her alone. Jack wasn't sure what to think. The girl had just revealed something truly frightening, and his mind was racing. Who was this man she was talking about? Why had he been chasing her for days? There were too many unanswered questions, and he wasn't sure if he could solve them all. All Jack knew for sure was that she needed help, and he wasn't going to turn his back on her now. He glanced back at the truck, his eyes shifting nervously from the empty highway to the girl standing beside him. He could feel the cold night air cutting through his jacket, but he barely noticed it. His focus was entirely on her, on getting her out of harm's way. Jack didn't want to leave her alone out here for one more second, especially after what she'd said about being followed. "Okay," Jack said after a long pause, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together. But I think it's safer if we get off this road. I don't want to risk anything happening while we're out here in the middle of nowhere." The girl nodded, looking relieved that Jack had taken charge. She was still trembling, but it seemed like she was starting to trust him a little more, though her fear was far from gone. Jack could tell by the way her eyes darted from side to side, constantly scanning the empty road, looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. Jack opened the passenger door to his truck and gestured for the girl to climb in. She hesitated for a moment before slowly walking over, her steps careful, almost as if she didn't fully trust the vehicle. She glanced at Jack one last time before getting in, sliding onto the seat with a soft, uncertain sigh. She pulled the door shut quickly, locking it as if it would offer some safety from the unknown threat. Jack got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The truck roared to life, breaking the silence of the night. He could feel his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, but he kept his focus on the road. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. He was a trucker used to long drives and dealing with all sorts of weather, but this was different. This was about more than just getting from point A to point B. This was about protecting someone who clearly needed it. As the truck rumbled down the highway, Jack kept a careful eye on the rearview mirror. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. Every time he glanced back, all he could see was the empty stretch of road. But something still didn't feel right. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "He's always there, just out of sight." Jack tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just paranoia. He was on edge after everything that had happened in the past few minutes, but he couldn't help the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Who was this man she was running from? And why would he go so far as to chase a young girl like this? He glanced at the girl beside him. She had pulled her jacket tighter around her body, and her arms were wrapped around herself, almost as if she were trying to disappear into the seat. Her eyes were wide, scanning the road, looking out the windows in quick, frantic glances. She seemed to be hyper-aware of every little sound and movement outside. Jack decided to break the silence. "Hey," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm going to take us to a safe place. I don't know who this guy is, but we'll figure something out. Don't worry." The girl didn't respond immediately. Her face was pale in the dim light of the truck's interior. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running. He always finds me." Jack's chest tightened at her words. He couldn't imagine what it must be like, always looking over your shoulder, never knowing if you're truly safe. He looked over at her, trying to offer some comfort. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "I'll make sure you're safe. We're going to get through this." The girl nodded but didn't speak again. She just stared out the window, lost in thought, the weight of the past few days pressing heavily on her shoulders. Jack didn't know what had happened to her, but he knew that this wasn't just a case of being lost on the highway. This girl had been through something terrible, and it wasn't over yet. As they continued driving, Jack kept his foot on the gas pedal, watching for any signs of trouble. But the road was still empty, the headlights of his truck slicing through the darkness as they made their way through the night. Jack had no idea what was waiting for them around the next corner, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until she was safe. The truck rumbled steadily down the highway, the sound of the tires rolling on the road the only noise filling the quiet night. Jack kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was racing. Who was this man that the girl kept talking about? Why had he been chasing her for days? What had happened to her that had led her to this moment? The girl sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her face tense. Her arms were tightly wrapped around her body, as if she was trying to hold herself together. Jack could see that she was lost in thought, her mind far away. He knew she had been through something awful, but she still hadn't told him everything. There was more to this story than she was letting on. Jack glanced at her, noticing the way her body trembled despite being inside the warm truck. She was still so scared, her fear clear in the way she looked out the window, almost as if she expected someone to jump out at any moment. After a few moments of silence, Jack decided to break it. "You can talk to me, you know," he said gently. "I'm not going to judge you, but you need to tell me what's really going on. If you're running from someone, we need to know who they are." The girl didn't answer right away. She just stared ahead, her face a mask of worry. Jack could tell she was struggling with something deep inside, like she was afraid to open up. Finally, after what seemed like forever, she spoke, her voice barely audible over the hum of the truck's engine. It's hard to explain," she whispered, her eyes glancing toward Jack before quickly looking away again. "I didn't want anyone to know, but I don't think I have a choice anymore. I was living with someone. A man, but it wasn't what you'd think. He wasn't my boyfriend or anything like that. He was a stranger who just showed up in my life." Jack furrowed his brow, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean? How did he get into your life?" The girl looked out the window again, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Her voice shook as she continued. He was always around. He wasn't dangerous at first. He seemed nice, and I didn't think anything was wrong. But then it started getting strange. He would show up at my work, at places I went to. He'd always be there, watching me, making sure I didn't go anywhere without him. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The feeling of unease was building inside him. He could hear the fear in her voice, and it made him even more determined to get her away from whatever was chasing her. "That doesn't sound right. What happened next?" The girl's face twisted with a painful memory. "I started to feel trapped. I didn't know how to get away. He would say things, creepy things, that made me feel like I couldn't escape. If I tried to leave, he'd follow me. He'd show up at my door, at my car, out of nowhere. He kept saying things like, 'You're mine now. I'm always going to find you.'" Jack felt his stomach twist at the thought. The idea of someone being controlled like that, of being unable to escape from someone who watched every move you made, was terrifying. "So you decided to leave him?" The girl nodded, but her expression became even more somber. "I had to. It was the only way. I couldn't stay anymore. I couldn't live like that, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid of what he would do next. So, one night, I left. I packed up everything I could and ran. But he didn't stop. He started following me, just like he said he would. I thought I could get away, but it was like he knew where I was at all times. I started getting scared, really scared, because I had no idea what he would do if he caught me." Jack's heart ached for her. No one should have to live in fear like that. She was a young woman who should have been able to live her life without worrying about someone constantly watching her. "You've been running ever since." The girl nodded again, the tears starting to well up in her eyes. "Yeah. I've been running from him for days. I don't know how much longer I can keep going. I thought I lost him when I got on this highway, but now I don't know what to do anymore." Jack took a deep breath. This wasn't just some runaway girl. She was someone who had been through an unimaginable nightmare. And now, whoever this man was, he was still out there, hunting her down. Jack didn't know what he could do to help, but he knew he wasn't going to let her face this alone. "You're safe now," Jack said softly, his voice full of determination. We're not going to let him find you. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe." The girl looked at him, a small glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She wasn't alone anymore. Jack was going to do everything in his power to make sure she stayed safe, no matter what it took. The truck's headlights cut through the dark night, casting long shadows on the road ahead. Jack's mind was spinning as he tried to process everything the girl had just told him. She had been living in constant fear, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid. Now, after finally running away, she had ended up on this deserted highway in the middle of nowhere. He glanced over at her, sitting beside him in the passenger seat, her body still tense. She had stopped crying, but her fear hadn't gone away. It was clear that the weight of her situation was heavy on her shoulders. Jack didn't blame her for feeling that way. Who wouldn't be afraid, knowing someone dangerous was after them? The girl's name was Sarah, and Jack had learned in their brief conversation that she had been running from a man who seemed to know her every move. His words echoed in Jack's mind. "You're mine now. I'm always going to find you." What kind of person would do that? What kind of man hunted someone down like an animal? Jack shuddered at the thought. "Where are we going?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, shaking him from his worries. Her eyes were still fixed on the road ahead, but there was a question in her tone that Jack could hear. She wasn't sure where she could go, and who could blame her? She had been running for so long, with no real plan other than to get away from the man who was chasing her. Jack thought for a moment. He knew he couldn't just keep dragging forever. They needed a plan, somewhere safe to go, somewhere this man couldn't find them. But where could they go? Jack had been on the road for years, but he didn't know the area well enough to find a place that could truly keep them hidden. "There's a small town up ahead," Jack said slowly. "It's not much, but it's better than staying out here on the highway. We can get some rest, maybe figure out what to do next." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you think we'll be safe there? What if he's following us?" Jack tried to offer a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if it would help. "We'll be fine for now. He can't be right behind us, and once we get there, we can figure out what to do. But you can't keep running forever. We need to take a stand, and I'll help you." Sarah nodded slowly, but her expression didn't change. She still seemed nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the seatbelt. Jack understood her fear. It wasn't easy to trust someone, especially after everything she had been through. But Jack had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this man hurt her. She deserved to feel safe again. As the truck rumbled down the road, Jack kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of danger. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, but there was nothing in sight. Still, the feeling of unease lingered in the air, a quiet reminder that they were both in danger. After what felt like hours, the lights of a small town appeared in the distance. It wasn't much, just a few buildings scattered around the road, but it was a place where they could stop and figure out what to do next. Jack felt a small sense of relief wash over him. They were almost there. They could at least take a breath, even if it was just for a moment. When they finally reached the town, Jack slowed the truck and pulled into a gas station. It was quiet, only a few cars parked near the pumps. He turned off the engine and looked over at Sarah, who seemed both relieved and still on edge. "We'll stay here for a bit," Jack said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Let's get some rest and think this through." Sarah looked at him, her expression still uncertain. "What if he finds us here?" They both climbed out of the truck, and Sarah took a deep breath as the cool air hit her face. Jack stayed close to her as they walked toward the small convenience store attached to the gas station. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She hadn't had a moment to rest in days, and it was starting to show. They stepped inside, and the bell above the door jingled as they entered. The man behind the counter looked up, his expression neutral. He didn't say anything at first, but Jack could tell he was sizing them up. Maybe it was because of how tired and scared Sarah looked, or maybe it was just his job to be cautious. Either way, Jack could sense that they were strangers in town, and that made him uneasy. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice a little gruff. Jack nodded. "We're just passing through. We need a place to stay for the night, somewhere safe." The man studied them for a moment before nodding toward a small motel down the road. "You can try the motel up the street. It's quiet, but I can't guarantee anything. It's off-season, so it should be empty." Jack felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were safe. For now. The small motel was nothing fancy, just a few single-story buildings lined up along a cracked parking lot. Jack pulled the truck up to a space near the office, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as he shifted into park. The cool air of the evening felt a little sharper now, and Jack could see his breath in the dim light of the street lamp. Sarah didn't say much as they climbed out of the truck. She seemed quieter than usual, her gaze focused on the ground beneath her feet, as if the weight of the past few days was too much for her to carry. Jack could see her shoulders tense up with every step. It was clear she wasn't used to feeling safe anymore. And even though this small motel seemed like the perfect place to hide for a while, he couldn't help but feel a lingering worry. What if that man had followed them here? Jack looked over at Sarah. "You okay?" he asked gently, wanting to make sure she was still with him, still willing to trust him. Sarah gave him a small, tired smile. "I don't know," she said softly. "I've been running for so long. I don't know what normal feels like anymore." Jack nodded. He could understand that. For someone who had been on the run, always looking over their shoulder, normal probably felt like a distant memory. Jack had been on the road for years, but he never had to live with the fear Sarah carried every day. "Look, we're just going to take a break," Jack said, trying to sound reassuring. "You can rest here tonight, and we'll figure out what to do tomorrow. You're not alone anymore." Sarah didn't say anything. She just nodded quietly and walked toward the office, Jack following closely behind. The old bell above the door rang as they entered the small, dimly lit room. The clerk behind the counter glanced up, his tired eyes barely registering their presence. "Need a room?" the clerk asked in a flat tone, his voice rough from years of too many late nights. "Yeah," Jack answered. "One for the night, just a place to rest." The clerk looked at them for a moment, then pulled out a key from behind the counter and slid it across the counter to Jack. "Room 7. It's the last one available." "Thanks," Jack said, grabbing the key. He turned to Sarah, who had remained quiet since entering the office. "Let's go." As they walked out of the office and toward the room, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. At least for now, they were safe. They had a roof over their heads, and they could finally take a break. But the nagging worry in the back of his mind never really left. He kept thinking about that man. Was he out there, watching them, or had they finally shaken him off for good? The motel room was simple. 2 single beds with a small dresser and a TV on the far wall. The air inside smelled faintly of dust, but it was a far cry from the cold, empty highway they had left behind. Jack tossed the key on the small table beside the door, then turned to Sarah. "Do you want to lay down for a bit?" Jack asked, his voice softer than before. "You need rest." Sarah hesitated, looking around the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After all the running, all the fear, a quiet, dark room felt like the safest place in the world. Slowly, she nodded and walked toward one of the beds, sitting down on the edge. Jack noticed how her hands shook as she pulled off her shoes and stretched her legs out. Jack sat on the other bed, watching her quietly for a moment. He didn't know what to say to make her feel better. What do you say to someone who's been through so much? He wasn't sure, but he knew that staying calm and giving her space was the best thing he could do for now. After a few minutes, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I know I must seem crazy, always looking over my shoulder, acting paranoid, but I can't help it. I just don't know what to do anymore." Jack looked at her, his face softening. "You're not crazy. You're scared, and that's okay. What you're going through is something no one should have to go through, but you don't have to face it alone anymore. I'm here." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. I feel like I was running out of options." "You don't need to thank me," Jack said. "I'm just doing what anyone would do. You deserve to be safe." There was a long silence as Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion of the past few days take over. Jack sat quietly on the bed, watching her. He could see the tension slowly easing from her shoulders, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. She was still living with that constant fear, that feeling that someone was always out there, watching. Jack knew that they couldn't stay here forever. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds, casting soft lines of light across the motel room. Jack slowly opened his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. He had barely slept, his mind still running through all the things they had to do. They couldn't stay at this motel forever, but where could they go next? He glanced over at Sarah, still sleeping soundly in the bed across from him. Her face was relaxed now, free of the tension that had been there the night before. For the first time in days, she looked peaceful. Jack didn't want to wake her, but he knew they had to start making decisions. They couldn't keep running from the man who had been chasing her. The night before, after Sarah had gone to sleep, Jack had spent hours thinking about their options. He didn't know how much longer he could keep her safe. The man who was after her wasn't going to stop, and Jack didn't have the resources to protect her forever. They needed a plan. Jack stood up quietly, trying not to disturb Sarah, and walked over to the small window. He peeked outside, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot. The day was just beginning, and there was still no sign of danger. For now, they were safe, but how long would that last? The man could show up at any moment. Jack sighed and rubbed his face with his hands. They couldn't keep running forever. Sarah needed to be somewhere safe, where she could start over and live without fear. But how could they make that happen? Just as Jack was about to turn away from the window, he heard movement behind him. He turned to see Sarah sitting up in bed, her hair messy and her eyes still heavy with sleep. She looked at him for a moment, and then her gaze shifted to the clock on the wall. "What time is it?" she asked softly, her voice hoarse from sleep. "It's morning," Jack replied, giving her a small smile. "You slept well." Sarah nodded but didn't look like she believed it. "I don't feel like I slept at all," she said. "I keep thinking about everything." About him. Jack understood. The fear hadn't left her, and it wouldn't for a long time. She had been through too much, and no amount of rest could take away that constant worry. He needed to get her to a place where she could feel safe again, but that meant they had to make some tough choices. "Listen," Jack said, his voice firm. "We need to figure out what to do next. We can't stay here forever. You deserve more than this." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just stared at the floor, her fingers playing with the edge of the blanket. She looked lost, unsure of what the next step should be. Jack couldn't blame her. She had been running for so long, she probably didn't know where to turn. "We can't keep moving around like this," Jack continued. "We need to make a plan. A real one." "I know," Sarah whispered. "But where do we go? How do I make him stop looking for me?" Jack thought for a moment, weighing their options. He had a few ideas, but none of them felt like the perfect solution. It wasn't just about hiding. They needed to figure out a way to make this man back off for good. "There's a place," Jack said slowly. "I know a friend who owns a farm up in the mountains. It's isolated, and nobody knows about it. We could go there for a while, lay low, and figure out what to do next." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide. "But will it be safe there? What if he finds us?" Jack nodded. "It's not a guarantee, but it's better than staying here. We'll have more time to think, and we'll be harder to find in the middle of nowhere." "We'll go together," Jack said firmly. "And I'll make sure you're safe. No one's going to hurt you again." Sarah finally nodded, though her face was still uncertain. Okay, let's go. Jack felt a small sense of relief wash over him. He knew it wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a start. They couldn't stay in the motel forever, and they couldn't keep running from the past. They needed to face it and figure out how to stop this man once and for all. He quickly packed their things, his movements quick and purposeful. As he grabbed the last of their things, he turned to Sarah, who was still sitting on the bed, looking lost in thought. "You ready?" Jack asked gently. Sarah nodded, standing up and walking toward him. There was still fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a hint of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the fresh start she needed. As they walked out of the room, Jack felt a sense of determination rise within him. They had a long road ahead, and it wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't about to let her go through this alone. Together, they would figure out a way to put an end to this nightmare. The drive up to the mountains was quiet. The roads were empty, and the air grew cooler with every mile they traveled. Jack kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was still racing. He knew they were taking a huge risk by heading to the farm, but he also knew it was their best chance. They needed time, space, and a place where they could breathe without constantly looking over their shoulders. As the truck climbed higher, the landscape around them began to change. The small towns and fields gave way to thick forests, and the road became narrower. Jack could see Sarah glancing out the window, her eyes scanning the trees and the distant mountains. She hadn't said much since they left the motel, but he could tell she was still on edge. The fear was still there, deep down inside her. "Are you sure this place is safe?" Sarah asked quietly, breaking the silence. Jack glanced over at her, trying to sound reassuring. "It's the safest place I know. My friend's farm is far off the main roads, and the nearest neighbor is miles away. No one's going to find us there." Sarah nodded but didn't look convinced. Jack could understand. She had been running for so long that it was hard to believe any place could truly be safe, but he was determined to give her that peace of mind, even if just for a little while. After a few more miles, they finally reached the turnoff that led to the farm. The road was even rougher here, with rocks and branches scattered across the path. Jack slowed the truck, maneuvering carefully as the trees closed in around them. The silence of the forest was almost unnerving, but Jack knew it was exactly what they needed. No one would be able to find them out here. As they turned a sharp corner, the farm came into view. It was an old place, but it had its charm. A large barn sat to the side, and a few chickens wandered around in the yard. A small house stood near the barn, its windows dark and still. This was the place where Jack's friend, Mike, had lived for years. Mike was a quiet man, someone who valued his privacy. Jack had helped him out with a few things in the past, and now he was calling in that favor. He pulled the truck up to the front of the house and parked. For the first time in days, he felt like they could finally relax. He turned off the engine and looked over at Sarah. She was still looking at the farm, but there was a new look in her eyes. It wasn't the same fear or uncertainty from before. It was something else, something lighter. "Is this it?" Sarah asked, her voice softer than before. "This is it," Jack said with a smile. "We're here. You can rest now." Sarah let out a slow breath and nodded. She didn't say anything more, but Jack could tell she was starting to trust him. Maybe, just maybe, this place could give her the chance to start over. He only hoped that the man who had been chasing her wouldn't find them here. Jack got out of the truck and opened the door for Sarah. Together, they walked toward the house. The door creaked as Jack pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The house was small but cozy, with old wooden floors and a warm fireplace in the corner. It smelled like wood and fresh air, a stark contrast to the cold, empty feeling of the highway they had left behind. "Make yourself at home," Jack said as he set their bags down on the couch. "Mike isn't here right now, but he should be back later today. He'll help us figure out what to do next." Sarah sat down on the couch, her eyes scanning the room. She seemed more relaxed now, but there was still a hint of worry in her gaze. Jack could see that she was still processing everything. The last few days had been a blur of fear and running, and it was going to take time for her to fully let her guard down. "Thank you, Jack," Sarah said quietly. "I don't know how I would have made it without you. I don't feel so alone anymore." Jack smiled gently. "You're not alone. You never have to be again." He walked to the window and looked out at the quiet farm. The sun was higher in the sky now, and the world seemed so peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to relax. They were safe for now. The man who had been chasing Sarah hadn't found them yet, and maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to rebuild their lives. As Jack turned back to Sarah, he noticed the small smile on her face. She was still a long way from healing, but for the first time, she seemed to believe that things could get better. It wasn't going to be easy, but they had a chance, and that was all they needed. "You can stay here as long as you need to," Jack said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." Sarah's smile grew a little wider, and for the first time in days, she looked like she might finally feel safe again. She didn't have to be afraid anymore. Not here. Not now. For the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to hope.